the search for Nancy Guthrie. I am still here in Tucson, Arizona.
That on today.com, the vice president says donations like the one from the Guthrie family.
It piles pain upon pain.
Theories that her sister Annie Guthrie, brother-in-law Tommaso Cioni, or brother Cameron Guthrie had been involved with the...
There are no words. There are no words. I don't understand. I'll never understand.
Day 70. 70 days since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her quiet home in the peaceful hills near Tucson. And tonight, something is happening behind the scenes that investigators are struggling to contain. Because according to multiple whispers leaking from inside the task force, the news we've been hearing since day one might not just be incomplete, it might be completely backwards. Let me repeat that. For 70 days the public was told this was a simple disappearance. An elderly woman gone without a trace. A quiet neighborhood. No suspects. No obvious motive. Just a mystery. But now insiders are hinting at something far darker. Something that suggests this case didn't begin the night Nancy disappeared. It may have started weeks earlier, quietly unfolding in plain sight while nobody realized what they were actually looking at. And here's the part that has investigators extremely nervous tonight. One source allegedly said during a closed-door briefing, Day 11 is the date no one wants to talk about. Why? What could have happened on a single day that suddenly makes the entire timeline look wrong? Because if what's being whispered tonight is true, then the real question isn't just what happened to Nancy Guthrie. The real question is, who knew something was wrong long before anyone else did? 70 days ago, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie looked like the kind of mystery that usually resolves quickly. An elderly woman, a quiet home, a calm neighborhood tucked into the foothills outside Tucson. The kind of place where the loudest sound most nights is a passing car or a barking dog somewhere down the street. Nothing about it suggested a national news. Nothing about it hinted at something darker unfolding behind the scenes. At first, authorities described the situation exactly how you'd expect. A routine missing person investigation. Search teams combing the area. Neighbors asked if they saw anything unusual.
News Nation exclusive on the search for Nancy Guthrie. It's been over 2 months since she went missing, and despite all the national attention, we still have no idea what happened to her or where she might be.
The press conferences started happening and the interviews with Nanos. What were you thinking?
Shut your mouth. Stop talking. That's pretty much what we were all saying. Is why is he out there saying that?
Local news crews setting up cameras at the edge of the street. But almost immediately, something felt off. Because the timeline surrounding Nancy's disappearance wasn't just unclear, it was strangely quiet. No forced entry, no immediate suspects, no dramatic evidence left behind. Just a house that looked almost untouched. And investigators quickly realized something unsettling about Nancy's life. She was the opposite of unpredictable. For decades she had lived in the same home near Catalina foothills. Same routines, same grocery store. Same neighbors waving from their driveways every morning. People who knew her described a life built almost entirely around consistency. Which sounds harmless, until investigators started looking at it from another angle. Because a predictable life isn't just peaceful. It's also easy to study. And according to several sources connected to the investigation, that possibility is exactly what began worrying authorities in the early days of the case. Neighbors began remembering small details that seemed meaningless at the time. A vehicle parked along the street for longer than usual. Someone standing near the sidewalk late in the evening. A delivery truck that nobody on the block remembered ordering. At first, those observations were dismissed as coincidence. After all, strange cars and unfamiliar faces appear in neighborhoods every day. But as the investigation deepened, those fragments started to form a pattern. And patterns make investigators nervous. One resident reportedly told detectives that during the weeks before Nancy disappeared, they noticed a car parked near the same corner multiple times. Not every day. Not even every week. Just occasionally. Almost like someone testing how often they could appear without attracting attention. At the time, nobody thought to report it. Why would they? The neighborhood wasn't known for crime. In fact, the foothills area outside Tucson is often described as one of the quieter residential zones in the region. But once Nancy vanished, those old memories suddenly started feeling different. Because the more investigators listened, the more they realized something troubling. Several neighbors had noticed unusual activity, but never at the same time. One person remembered a stranger walking slowly past the house on a weekend morning. Another mentioned seeing someone standing near the edge of the property late at night weeks earlier. A third witness recalled what looked like someone sitting in a parked vehicle for nearly 40 minutes without ever getting out. Individually, None of those details meant much. Together, they painted a picture that investigators couldn't ignore. A picture of someone returning to the same area more than once, and returning carefully, almost like they were learning the environment piece by piece. But that possibility raised an even more disturbing question. If someone really had been observing Nance's routine, how long had it been happening? Because once authorities started pulling surveillance footage from nearby homes, they began noticing something unusual. The sightings weren't random. They seemed to follow a rhythm. Weekdays were quiet. Weekends were different. According to investigative chatter circulating among local reporters, several of the suspicious sightings near Nance's home happened on Saturdays or Sundays, which immediately made analysts wonder whether someone was deliberately choosing times when activity in the neighborhood was more relaxed. People sleeping in, fewer commuters, less predictable traffic, the perfect environment for someone trying to blend into the background. And that's when the investigation quietly started shifting away from a simple disappearance. Because detectives began exploring a theory that sounded almost unbelievable in the early stages. What if Nancy wasn't randomly targeted? What if someone had been studying her routine long before the night she vanished? That theory gained momentum when analysts started examining digital data connected to the home. Modern houses collect more information than most people realize. Smart doorbells, security cameras, Wi-Fi networks quietly recording device connections. And when forensic specialists began reviewing those digital records, they reportedly noticed activity that didn't match the normal household pattern. Several login attempts on Nance's online accounts had occurred in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. At first, they looked like harmless background noise, the kind of automated login attempts that happen across the internet every day. But the timing raised eyebrows, because some of those digital attempts appeared within days of the physical sightings reported by neighbors, which meant two different things might have been happening at the same time. Someone watching the house.
That they actually do have a potential suspect in the case, and the identity is rather shocking.
They're getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Search for Nancy Guthrie.
Theories that her sister Annie Guthrie, brother-in-law Tommaso Cioni, or brother Cameron Guthrie had been involved.
They threatened to kill Nancy Guthrie. We had not heard that until now. We always knew that there was a consequence threatened if you don't pay by Thursday. Then by Monday, there's a second deadline, and the consequence is that the money goes up, I think, to $6 million. But we never heard that the other consequence was that they threatened to kill Nancy Guthrie.
And someone probing the digital side of Nance's life. Coincidence? Maybe. But investigators don't like coincidences when a person has vanished. One analyst reportedly summarized the concern in a briefing with a single chilling line. Whoever this was, they weren't guessing her routine. They were learning it. And if that statement is accurate, it changes the entire nature of the case. Because it suggests Nance's disappearance wasn't the beginning of the news. It might have been the final step of something already in motion. Meanwhile, the public narrative remained relatively simple. Most news coverage continued describing the case as a mysterious disappearance involving an elderly resident of the foothills outside Tucson. Search operations expanded. Volunteers combed nearby desert terrain. Flyers appeared on community bulletin boards. But behind the scenes, the investigation was becoming far more complicated than anyone outside the task force realized. Detectives weren't just asking who might have harmed Nancy. They were asking who might have been watching her, and how long that observation had been happening before anyone noticed. Because if the emerging pattern was real, then Nance's quiet life had been quietly mapped by someone who understood it better than anyone suspected. And that possibility leads directly to the question that investigators are now struggling to answer on day 70. If someone truly studied Nance's routines for weeks, then the disappearance wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, carefully, patiently, and perhaps by someone who had already spent enough time in the neighborhood to feel completely invisible. As investigators dug deeper into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, something inside the task force began to shift. Quietly at first, then suddenly all at once. Because the more data analysts pulled from the digital systems surrounding Nance's home, the more it became clear that the early theory of a simple disappearance was collapsing. And it started with something investigators almost ignored: a corrupted file. According to internal chatter circulating among reporters covering the case, a forensic technician reviewing archived camera data from a nearby smart security system noticed something strange buried inside the recovery logs. At first glance, it looked like a technical error, a timestamp that didn't match the official timeline investigators had been working with since the beginning. Normally, glitches like that are routine when recovering damaged files. Cameras lose power. Software mislabels timestamps. Data becomes fragmented. But this time the technician did something unusual. They ran the recovery process again, then again. And when the data stabilized, the timestamp didn't change, which meant the error wasn't a glitch. It was real. And if the timestamp was correct, it placed an unknown figure near Nance's property weeks before the night investigators believed the case actually began. That single discovery triggered a quiet but immediate escalation inside the investigation, because it suggested something no one had officially considered before. Someone may have been accessing the property long before Nancy vanished. Not on the night of the disappearance. Not during the search window investigators originally focused on. But earlier. Much earlier. Suddenly detectives found themselves doing something they rarely enjoy doing during an active investigation. Rebuilding the entire timeline from scratch. One investigator allegedly described the moment like this during an internal discussion. We might have been solving the wrong version of this case. Think about what that means. For 70 days, the investigation had been centered around a specific event window, the night Nancy disappeared from her home near Catalina Foothills. Everything was built around that assumption. Witness interviews, search operations, digital evidence reviews. But if someone had already been near the property weeks earlier, the disappearance might not have been the beginning of the crime. It might have been the final act of a much longer process. And once that idea entered the investigation, a flood of previously overlooked details started resurfacing. Detectives began revisiting old witness reports that had been dismissed early in the case. One neighbor, for example, had originally mentioned seeing someone standing near the edge of Nance's property late one evening. At the time, it seemed insignificant. People walk through neighborhoods all the time. But when investigators re-examined the date of that sighting, they realized it happened during the same week as the newly discovered camera footage. Another witness remembered something even stranger. A vehicle parked near the corner of the street during daylight hours on a Saturday. The driver never exited the car. They simply sat there for nearly half an hour before leaving. Again, it had seemed harmless when first reported. But when analysts mapped that sighting against other observations from the area, it matched the same emerging pattern investigators were beginning to see. Weekends. The suspicious activity always seemed to happen on weekends, which raised an unsettling possibility. Someone might have been returning to the neighborhood repeatedly, using the quieter pace of weekend mornings to observe Nance's routine without drawing attention. And the more investigators studied that pattern, the more structured it began to look. One behavioral analyst reportedly summarized the theory during a briefing with a phrase that immediately caught everyone's attention. This isn't random surveillance. This looks like rehearsal. In other words, someone testing the environment, studying entry points, learning routines, understanding when neighbors were home and when they weren't. If that theory is accurate, it means Nance's disappearance wasn't the beginning of the crime. It was the moment the preparation phase ended. And that realization triggered another disturbing discovery inside the digital evidence review. Because around the same time investigators were identifying the weekend surveillance pattern, cybersecurity analysts examining Nance's online activity noticed something else. Unusual login attempts. Not just one or two. Several. Spread across multiple weeks leading up to the disappearance. At first, those attempts were categorized as routine cyber noise, the automated login attempts that occur constantly on internet-connected accounts. But once analysts compared the timestamps with the physical sightings near Nance's home, something unexpected happened. The patterns lined up. The digital login attempts were occurring during the same weekends neighbors reported seeing suspicious activity near the property. Two completely different types of evidence were now pointing to the same timeline, which meant investigators were suddenly facing a possibility that sounded almost unbelievable. Someone might have been studying Nance's life from two directions at once, physically and digitally. That theory created immediate tension inside the task force. Because if someone had access to Nance's digital accounts, they might have known far more about her routine than any neighbor could observe from the outside. Appointments, communication patterns, moments when she was alone, all of it potentially visible to someone who knew where to look. One cyber analyst allegedly summarized the concern in blunt terms during a closed meeting. This wasn't just someone watching a house. This was someone mapping a life. And once that idea entered the investigation, the suspect profile began changing dramatically. Early theories suggested the disappearance might have involved a random offender passing through the area. But the emerging evidence didn't support randomness. It suggested patience, familiarity, and access, which led investigators toward a new group of possible suspects. Not strangers traveling through the area. People who already had legitimate reasons to be nearby. Construction workers, delivery drivers, utility contractors, service technicians, individuals who could appear in the neighborhood repeatedly without anyone questioning why they were there. One analyst reportedly described the profile in a way that sent a chill through the room. If you saw him, you wouldn't think twice. You'd assume he belonged there. And that realization created a new wave of interviews throughout the neighborhood near Tucson. Investigators began revisiting records from construction projects that had taken place in the area during the weeks before Nancy disappeared. They looked at service calls, delivery schedules, maintenance visits, anything that might explain why the same individual could appear multiple times without drawing suspicion. But the more they searched, the more complicated the picture became, because one witness statement began attracting renewed attention. The statement described seeing the same individual near Nancy's property on multiple weekends. But what made the observation unusual wasn't just the repetition. It was the behavior. According to the witness, the person didn't behave the same way each time. Sometimes they stood still near the sidewalk. Other times they appeared to be walking with purpose down the street. And once they were seen simply leaning against a vehicle while looking at a phone. At first glance, those behaviors seemed inconsistent. But behavioral analysts reviewing the account saw something different. Adaptation. The kind of subtle adjustments someone might make if they were gradually becoming more comfortable inside an environment they were studying. And that is the moment investigators reportedly realized something deeply unsettling. If the witness account is accurate, then the person near Nancy's property wasn't just observing the neighborhood. They were learning how to exist inside it without being noticed. Which leads to a question investigators are still struggling with on day 70. How many times did that person return before anyone realized what they were seeing? Because if the surveillance pattern truly stretched back weeks, then the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie may have been the final move in a plan that had been unfolding quietly right in front of everyone. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is this. If the suspect spent that much time studying the environment, then by the time Nancy vanished, they already knew exactly what they were doing. But by the time the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie reached day 70, something else began happening that investigators hadn't fully anticipated. The case wasn't just evolving inside the task force anymore. It was exploding across the internet. Within hours of the newest rumors leaking out, social media platforms were flooded with speculation. Threads began appearing everywhere. People dissecting timelines, analyzing surveillance patterns, arguing over theories about what might have happened in the quiet neighborhood outside Tucson. Hashtags started spreading rapidly. Posts questioning the official timeline. Posts accusing investigators of hiding key details. Posts claiming the entire news had been misunderstood from the beginning. And once the online discussion started gaining momentum, it became something far more chaotic than a typical missing person case. Because the public wasn't just asking what happened to Nancy. They were asking something much more dangerous. What if the investigation itself had missed the most important clue? That question alone was enough to ignite millions of views on true crime channels, podcasts, and viral discussion threads. Some users believed the emerging surveillance theory made perfect sense. They argued that someone patient enough to observe Nancy's routines for weeks could easily have waited for the right moment to act. Others pushed back hard, accusing commentators of turning a tragic disappearance into entertainment. Comment sections quickly turned into battlegrounds. One viral post read, "Someone studied her life like a schedule." Another user fired back seconds later, "This is exactly how misinformation spreads." Nobody has proof, but the debate didn't stay confined to the internet. Soon even television panels began discussing the growing speculation surrounding the case of Nancy Guthrie. Analysts on national broadcasts cautiously referenced rumors about pre-planning and surveillance patterns, though authorities still refused to confirm those details publicly. And that hesitation from officials only made the online conversation louder. Because every time investigators avoided answering a specific question, the internet filled the silence with its own theories. Some of those theories were reasonable. Others were wildly dramatic, but all of them had one thing in common. They suggested the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie might be far more complex than anyone originally believed. Meanwhile, inside the fictionalized investigation narrative circulating among journalists, a new detail began raising eyebrows. According to leaked summaries from internal discussions, analysts had started reconsidering something investigators thought they already understood: the location of the crime itself. Until now, the entire investigation had been centered around Nancy's home in the quiet foothills near Catalina Foothills. Every search operation, every surveillance review, every timeline reconstruction, everything started with the assumption that the critical moment occurred inside or immediately around the house. But a new theory quietly introduced inside the task force suggested something completely different. What if the crime didn't begin at the house at all? That possibility reportedly emerged during a review of Nancy's recent activity outside the neighborhood. Investigators began examining places she regularly visited in the weeks before her disappearance. Local stores, medical appointments, community events, anywhere she might have crossed paths with someone who later followed her routines back to her home. Because if the suspect first noticed Nancy somewhere else, then the surveillance pattern investigators were seeing near the house might have been only the second stage of the operation. And that idea changed the emotional weight of the case entirely. Instead of someone randomly discovering Nancy's home and targeting it, the suspect may have been studying Nancy herself long before anyone suspected danger. One source familiar with the internal discussions reportedly summarized the theory with a chilling line. "We thought the perimeter was her house. It may have been her entire life." That statement sent analysts back through every available record connected to Nancy's movements. Receipts, parking records, security cameras from nearby businesses. Investigators began asking a new question. Did anyone appear repeatedly in the background of those locations during the weeks leading up to the disappearance? The results of that review have not been publicly confirmed. But according to circulating reports, analysts may have noticed something unusual involving overlapping timelines between multiple individuals connected to the broader area around Tucson. People who had never been directly linked during the early stages of the investigation, but whose movements suddenly appeared in similar places during the same time window. That possibility opened a door investigators weren't prepared to walk through, because it raised a frightening question. What if this wasn't the work of a single individual? What if more than one person knew something about Nancy's routine? Inside the task force, that scenario created immediate tension. Coordinated activity would dramatically expand the scope of the case. More suspects, more motives, more complexity, and potentially far more difficulty identifying exactly who was responsible. But the most unsettling moment reportedly came from a line buried inside a redacted briefing summary that circulated among investigators. A single sentence that wasn't meant for the public to see. It read, "The critical evidence may already exist. It just wasn't recognized at the time." That statement froze the conversation among analysts reviewing the case, because it suggested something deeply frustrating for investigators. The clue they need might not be missing. It might already be sitting inside the evidence database. A photo, a video frame, a witness statement, something that seemed insignificant when first collected, but becomes important only after the timeline is understood correctly. And if that possibility is true, it means the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie may have reached the most dangerous stage of all. The moment when investigators realize the truth might have been visible from the very beginning, just hidden inside details nobody realized mattered. Which brings us back to day 70. Because tonight, the biggest mystery surrounding this case isn't just who might have taken Nancy Guthrie. It's how long the real news has been quietly sitting in the background while everyone focused on the wrong pieces of the puzzle. Was the surveillance pattern the key to everything? Was Nancy unknowingly targeted somewhere outside her home weeks before she vanished? Or is the public watching a news grow more complicated simply because the internet refuses to accept uncertainty? Right now, the answer to those questions remains unclear. But one thing is certain. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is no longer just a quiet mystery from a peaceful neighborhood near Tucson. It has become a case filled with shifting timelines, hidden patterns, and a possibility that investigators may have overlooked something critical in the earliest days of the search. And if the latest whispers coming from inside the investigation are even partially accurate, then the next update in this case might not just add a new clue. It might completely rewrite everything people thought they understood about what really happened. As day 70 closes on the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, one thing is becoming impossible to ignore. This case is no longer just about a missing person. It's about a timeline that keeps shifting, details that refuse to stay quiet, and a growing suspicion that the real news may have been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Think about everything we just walked through. Strange sightings in the neighborhood near Catalina foothills. Suspicious digital activity happening at the same time. A possible surveillance pattern unfolding over weekends. And investigators now questioning whether the disappearance even began at the house at all. That's not just unusual. That's the kind of development that completely changes how a case is understood. But here's the part that makes this news even more unsettling tonight. If the latest theories are correct, then the biggest clue may not be something investigators are still searching for. It might be something they already collected weeks ago, a piece of evidence sitting quietly in a file that nobody realized was important until now. So let me ask you something. Do you believe the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie was the result of a carefully planned operation that unfolded over weeks, maybe even months? Or do you think the internet has taken a tragic mystery and turned it into something far bigger than the evidence actually supports? Because right now, both possibilities are being debated across the internet. And your opinion matters here. Drop your theory in the comments. What do you think investigators might be missing in this case? And if you want to stay updated on the latest twists, revelations, and hidden details surrounding the case of Nancy Guthrie, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because if the past 70 days have taught us anything, it's that the next revelation could change everything.